You're listening to Content Logistics, a podcast for B2B marketers looking to build a content engine that drives revenue. In each episode, Camille Trent interviews the marketers behind the best content marketing flywheels and uncovers the tactical aspects of content production, from first draft to first customer.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Content Logistics. I'm your host, Camille Trent, and this episode's brought to you by my good friends, Tristan and Justin over at Motion. They are an agency that helps busy B2B tech marketers launch podcasts like this one. If you've been thinking about launching a podcast, but you need help with the production, you need help with the slicing of clips, you need help with the strategy, the design, any of that, they make that really simple so that you can just focus on the interview, focus on the guests, the strategy, and they will take care of everything post-production. Today, our guest is Nate Turner. He's the co-founder and CEO of 10Speed. He's coming on to talk about when and how to refresh old content before it decays. Nate, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks, Camille. I'm really excited to be here today.
Yeah, I'm excited about this topic. We're at the point in the podcast where I think we mentioned this in our emails, that it's really hard to come up with the unique content strategy that we'll cover. It's never before been talked about. But I really do feel like this one's unique and will be useful for folks. So first off, do you want to just give everyone a little bit of background on you and your content expertise?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was the first marketer at Sprout Social. So I joined early 2011. We helped kind of build and scale the inbound engine there to 100 million at IPO. And a huge part of that was sort of content marketing and SEO, playing a big part in that in terms of driving revenue, and built the process and systems that helped scale the blog to 1 million visits a month. From there, I left and was consulting with a number of SaaS companies for about a year and a half before seeing an opportunity to start 10Speed, which is a content optimization agency where we work with SaaS companies to help them kind of build and scale that content engine, leveraging content marketing and SEO. So I'm doing that now for a number of SaaS companies. I have a team of almost 10 remote agency and kind of in it day in and day out, and the stuff that we're going to talk about today. So excited to jump in.
Nice. That was perfect. Okay. So as I see the problem set up, and then I'll pass it to you to correct whatever I say, is that content goes stale really fast. And so it reminds me of, I think it's Jim Gaffigan. It's some comedian that was talking about how we used to just not know stuff. We used to just wonder how things worked, and then we would just go on not knowing because there wasn't an easy way to find out that information. And now, when we're oh, I wonder how old that actor is, we can just look it up on our phone, and there's no time in between where we just sit there and debate and wonder. We just instantly know, and it's kind of taken some of the fun out of things.
Yeah.
But I was thinking about that and how the internet and Google, and now even I think social and ChatGPT have changed all of this, right? Where we instantly have some sort of answer. It's not always guaranteed that it is the right answer,
Sure.
or the answer that you were looking for, but you're always able to get some sort of information. So all of this going back to content goes stale fast. And so I wanted to turn that over to you of how you see that problem of the speed of content today. And then just tell us a little bit about how you think about that tipping point. When does content get stale? What are some of those signs?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple factors. Certainly before you even get into any sort of performance or organic performance, there are just things that happen within your company that can cause your content to go stale. Product shots are the actual product has been updated and the screenshots are old, or the way you talk about the product, or you're not referencing actually the new features you built. There's all kinds of stuff just internally just working against you before you even get into any performance aspect of it. And then, when you get into that, the content decay really being sort of this slow, sometimes faster, but typically a slow decline in performance due to, no longer totally aligning with intent. You have external competition who's done something better than you on that topic. Sometimes have internal competition where you're actually creating multiple things that are not playing nicely together. There's a bit too much overlap, and so search engines kind of don't know which ones work together. A lot of things there that kind of play together in have different sort of timetables. That's where it kind of gets a bit more complex, is you have external factors, internal factors, and just general search intent. And that's, per page on your site. And so you then multiply that across all of the pages, and that's where it gets a bit more complex. So yeah, so I think it's hard to really pinpoint, I'd say, specific factors. Internally the product screenshots, you kind of know those markers. And then, early indicators may be things like you're starting to see impressions drop, or click-through rate dropping, things like that are maybe some early signs before you really see like precipitous losses in traffic and leads and revenue from certain content. So I'd say that's probably some of the early signs as well.
Nice. And then, yeah, just stretching that out, is it the impressions that's the biggest threat? The biggest problem with content decay is just, losing traffic, losing volume, or what do you see as like the biggest problem that content decay causes?
I would say ultimately it's really the further down the funnel is where you're going to feel the impact a bit more. You're going to be losing traffic, probably losing free trial signups or demos, and ultimately, revenue can also be impacted. So I would say that's probably the bigger area, and the more quiet complication of it all is just that you're working hard to build this content program. You're either hiring writers in-house or sourcing writers or working with agency or whatever, kind of building this process, figuring out what you want to write about, figure out what the voice is. Like, you're putting all this work into building this program. And if you're sort of ignoring that factor, then you have this undercurrent, kind of working against you over time that, maybe you're bringing, publishing new content each month that's bringing in thousands of new clicks, but you're also losing hundreds or thousands each month from older stuff decaying that you're not paying attention to. So I'd say that's the other big factor, is you just fail to really get the compounding growth and the traction that you're hoping for because you're not factoring that in.
Nice. Okay, cool. And then what was the first time that you started seeing this problem? Like you mentioned kind of your background on Sprout Social, and you got to that point where it was like massive scale. So I imagine there was a lot of maybe not duplicate content, but duplicate topics, right? And so you might have like run into some competition there, or everyone in social, started jumping on that bandwagon too. Of like, we should really get into this, especially since that's a lot of PLG. So I'd just be curious on like if this came up at Sprout Social, where you first kind of like started seeing this as like a market problem.
Yep. Yeah, I would say it's probably around 2015, 2016. Is where we actually, we didn't even, it wasn't labeled decay. Like, people weren't really talking about search intent then. Like, there were a lot of things that weren't necessarily the same, but Kevin, who's my co-founder at 10 Speed, and another person on my team were the ones that really started to say like, hey, like, we're seeing a ton of queries matching to this post, but like they're starting to fall off because it feels like it's not relevant anymore. And we think maybe if we refresh and add some content and do some of this stuff, we can actually get it back. We did, and it worked. And at that point, we probably had, 1,000 blog posts. So we had a pretty good library. So then it quickly became like, well, how do we figure out where else this is happening? How do we prioritize and do that? Because it worked well, we recaptured that. And so it basically became a project for like an entire quarter of, still creating some new stuff, but looking back and saying, where can we do this? And it was extremely effective. And so then that's where really, like, from there on, it became, how do we build the systems to know that we're checking regularly, we're building a balance between new and updating, doing a lot of that to really stay on top of it and be able to leverage that existing traffic as much as, and content as much as possible to continue growing. And I think the other piece that really built in from that was the recognition of a lot of content then had, if you have a post that maybe has 2,000 queries that are matching to one URL, they're not all on the first page, in top 10 like rankings. So you certainly have a lot there. And so you start to look at like what's close, like what's, 11 to 20, maybe it's there, like, and is it, we add more. And we actually ended up having a big part of our content strategy over the next couple of years was really finding those and saying, oh, actually looks like maybe you get added to that post, but there's enough of these queries here that it actually deserves its own post on that topic. And so we're going to create, like, that gets out of the roadmap, create a post, and then either pull that little bit out of the other one or build an internal link to say, you want more on this topic, go to this whole post about it. And so that also became part of it, was like preventing decay and updating, but then also finding new opportunities from some of that data as well.
Nice. Okay. Yeah. A lot of things are coming to mind here. So the first thing is with the key indicators. You mentioned some of them, and you mentioned some more just now. Is it's one thing, to make it to the first page of search, right? It's like another thing to actually get clicked on. It's another thing for that actual page to convert, right? So there's so much that goes into getting that end state result that you want, which is ultimately either free trials or revenue, right? Eventually customers. And so to get to that point, like there's a lot of different checkpoints on the content side. And so one question that I had was, how do you flag those and prioritize some of those things, right? Because I see kind of two ways of doing it. You mentioned that you guys took basically like a whole quarter the first time this happened of like, okay, let's just like do the deep clean basically, right? Like let's just like sit down and like do this right. But then afterwards, I assume it becomes more of like a maintenance thing that you could either do, for like a week every quarter. I'm just making this up, but you could do sort of like periodically, or you could do some sort of like alert system, right? Like when certain content is like in the danger zone where you're like, hey, like the clicks are down, impressions are down, like have some sort of formula of what to look for and what to consider like the red zone, right? And so essentially, how do you guys recommend dealing with that? Is it sort of a periodic thing? Is it alerts? Is it a combination?
Yeah, it's a great question. Certainly at that time, a good 6-7 years ago, there was not as much in terms of alerts and stuff. So we did it a bit more manually. I think there are certainly good things now within Ahrefs. ClearScope has I think it's still in beta, like a feature to really kind of track existing content performance as well. So I think there's more tooling that's bubbling up. It's never going to fully replace everything that has to go into watching it and analyzing it. But we really made it a part of our process. We essentially built content calendars and like topic roadmaps like one month in advance. And so essentially we had a time each month where our team was looking at the data, understanding what are some of the new topics we should be building into to kind of like continue to build on this topic authority, but then also, looking at the existing data and seeing where, things that have been declining over the last few months that need to get added into that. So it became part of just the monthly planning process. So I would say that's probably like a very easy thing for anyone to do is on some cadence, you're doing that monthly, probably quarterly for a lot of people, to kind of sit down and plan out what you're going to do. And so just make it part of that process. Is just also look at whatever Ahrefs, SEMrush, Search Console, any of those, like the last 3 months versus the 3 months before, and just sort by the, the biggest drops in impressions and clicks and use that as a priority. And then the other, I would say, is that you also want to look to know like, hey, here's the 5, 10, 25, whatever it might be, URLs that are very high performing for us. Like we know these are revenue generating, or they just bring in a ton of traffic, a ton of backlinks. And we want to really always be checking these and keeping these on our radar, even if they don't come up in that 3 month over 3 month view. That should just be another step, is to just look at the most important pages. So I think those are a few of the areas that I would recommend. And even now for our clients, like we typically build topic roadmaps 3 months at a time. So like at least every 3 months, we're looking at the existing content for clients and identifying where there's stuff that needs to get layered in as an update or a refresh or consolidation, something like that.
Yeah, it's a nice checklist of those kind of like three things of like essentially red light, green light, yellow light, right? Like what do we need to do? And I think the highest upside, it sounds like the highest leverage activities are either what's performing really well for us, like what's actually converting, and how can we either improve those pages or build upon, whatever topics are triggering that. And then on the other side, you have like the poor performing content, or like recently poor performing content, right? Where it was doing well and it had some sort of a drop off. So how can we like get that back up to what it was doing before? Those seem like the two biggest like opportunities. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I think those are definitely the two biggest. And your point on like red, yellow, green light made me think of one other thing, which is from that like kind of a yellow light perspective. If you're doing it monthly, that's pretty frequent, you may come across something that looks like this doesn't look like it's going in the right direction, but it doesn't really warrant it yet. And so we just basically like pushed it out a month. So we like put that on the list to like check again next month, basically. If you're doing it quarterly, you may run into that a little bit, but like it's not quite as frequent. But that is also a part of it too, is you're going to come across those that are kind of yellow light, like, I don't know what to do with it. And so it's easy just to kind of say, have a process to know where to put it so you don't forget, basically, and then check again in a couple weeks or wait for the next monthly cycle and then do that.
Yeah, that's smart. And it's so helpful for the content team in general to just kind of like know like what to be focusing on, right? Like what are the highest priority things, what to definitely not focus on, essentially like what's not even really on the roadmap in like the upcoming backlog. But then there's something in the middle of like, it's in the backlog. We're going to work on it this year, probably, but don't worry about it, for this month or this quarter. And so just putting everything there where it's like, I'm not going to forget about this thing because at least it's in the backlog somewhere, it's on the calendar somewhere, but we're just going to keep pushing it out if it's not, if it's not priority, if it's not either high upside or causing real problems, right? Okay, well, I think this is a good transition into what I kind of call like the qualification questions of like, who's this for? Like, who can benefit most from these types of things? And so, because you mentioned a few things that made me think about the win, as I call it.
Yeah.
So, which companies with like what amount of content need to think about this, right? Like, need to think about this as like a priority. And by this, I mean like content decay, right? And content updating. And so, at what point do you think, okay, there's enough content on our blog, or there's enough content that we've produced that we really need to think about maintenance and updates and all of that? So I think this goes to stage of company, right? Like maybe like size of company, but also like how robust like is the content engine?
Yes. So I'd say there's like two factors that are dependent on each other, and that's the amount of content you have and like how long you've been doing it. So one example would be for our own blog on 10Speed, we're not a like high volume publishing approach. And so we have, I think, about 30 posts, but some of them are almost 2 years old at this point. So when you combine those factors, like there's not thousands of posts, but some of them are almost 2 years old. So you have that time factor. But I would say most companies that we see start to have at least some opportunity at like maybe 75 to 100 posts, and you've been doing it for at least a year. But where you see like the need to have consistently, like we're doing 4 to 6 new posts every month, and we're refreshing 2 or 3 every month, will typically come when you have, over 250, 300 posts. It's just really kind of that numbers game of like, the amount you have and the time that they're decaying that you would need to be updating several each month. So I would say, it's not like, probably not anyone really having to worry about it in like the first year to maybe 18 months of publishing, unless they're going after really competitive stuff. But most people don't start a content program going after really competitive stuff. So I would say that's typically like, after 12 to 18 months is when you're starting to look at that. And then, certainly when you get into 7,500 blog posts, you're going to start having that occurring, probably at least once a quarter where you need to be doing some of that.
Yeah, that's a good call out of the age of the content too, right? So it's not just the cadence or how much you produce, but there's like a ranking factor of just the age of the content, right? And it's the natural decay with that, right? Like when bread gets moldy after like a week or so, like we know that there's like a timestamp on it. So kind of same thing for content. The other thing I wanted to call out is just like the type of company, right? And like the types of cadences that might be appropriate like for a company, because I hear often for agencies, consultants, really like most like service businesses, I would say, tend to have like lower volume. It's not always the case, but tend to have like lower volume, maybe more thought leadership, like style content in general. And so knowing that that's your strategy and why that's your strategy, and not necessarily changing that just because other successful businesses are. I don't know if business models always think about why our content strategy is a certain way. But I thought that was a nice call out because I've also seen it within SaaS specifically. Like there's very different types of like SaaS models. And so like two things I wanted to call out is the sort of PLG freemium model, like reliant on free trials, and you need a few of them or you need a lot of them because not all of them are going to convert, and you're willing to accept that. And with this, I think about more horizontal products too, right? So horizontal meaning like there's a bigger total addressable market, right? They appeal to across industries maybe. So I think of project management is like a good example. So a lot of different industries can use project management. It's not just for marketers, not just for SaaS. So something like that, you probably need like higher volume because you're also thinking about what are the how-to guides, what are all of the different use cases basically like for this product, and how can we have an answer for each of those sort of more high intent searches around that. So you think of that compared to more of like a smaller TAM, like high enterprise, like type product where maybe you don't need as many posts, but you need those to be very, very specific, very educated toward like a specific audience. But ultimately, maybe you just need 100 customers to be like a very, very successful
Absolutely.
business. So yeah, any other thoughts just around like company stage and like company type that you might need to consider like when thinking through like a content decay strategy within there?
Yeah, it's a great question. You're certainly going to need a higher velocity of addressing, the best way to say that, like you're going to need to address content decay a lot more for that horizontal play. I mean, that's very much what Sprout was, social media management across a ton of different industries and use cases. And so that's why we had to have so many systems. And, if you want to, I'm happy to get into more. There were a lot of things we really built and put in place to be able to do it at scale. But yeah, you're right that, maybe something in like cybersecurity, enterprise level type of product that's just very different. I think there's a couple things. One is the fundamentals of what causes content decay are still exactly the same. That doesn't change because of the business model. I think it just sort of needs to scales up or down relative to the size of your entire content program. So if you're like, you could have you just need to close 2 7-figure customers a year business model. You could be publishing 2 blog posts a month that are thought leadership, or you potentially could still be publishing 10 or 15 a month and having a big content program. Kind of depends on the space and who the buyer is and the pain points and how they consume and how they learn about your product. Like there's some variables there. So I would say it's kind of scales relative to the content program. And similar to like what I said for us, like we don't have a ton of content. We're not trying to, so we don't need to have some of these systems to be checking for decay and addressing, decay on 4 or 5 posts a month every month. Like that's just not necessary because it sort of fits the scale of where we're at. So, but yeah, I think it's a good point that the business model, I think even before you get to decay, the business model, who your buyer is, all that stuff should be dictating how you're approaching content marketing and the channels you're choosing. And maybe you do a lot less with blog content, but you have a podcast or something that's with every chief information officer, chief security officer coming on and talking or whatever. So yeah, so I think I hope that answers your question, but I agree you should fit it and kind of scale to that. But then the need for addressing decay should be relative to the scale of your program.
Yeah, I think that's a good point that most companies do have a content decay problem, right? Or do need to address some form of content decay. It may just like look a little bit different. What it made me think of too is thought leadership reports, like things like that. Like those are all things that can go stale fairly easily, but kind of for different reasons. Like there's news that'll come out that's like maybe we need to readdress like some of these quotes because this thing came out about this person, and like I don't know if we want them like representing our brand at this point. So there's that kind of stuff, right? And then there's also things like just the stats are outdated, right? You have some sort of like stats roundup piece or report, and you want to be able to replace that with the latest information. So again, like you look credible is part of the reason why. So there's that kind of like version of I would call like content decay to like address if you're a different if you might have like a different type of content strategy. So like that's something as I think about our business, which like we're at 6 employees right now, right? Like one content of like one and focus a little bit more on like newsletters and social content, right? And so but there's still need to like address things that are just like no longer correct or just like no longer relevant, right? Given like the recent news and climate. So that I thought was a nice point. All right. So I think we've actually covered some of these like what I would call like the qualification questions of like the who and when are really the biggest things, like who is this for? when do you need to start thinking about this? And so now, like, just diving a little bit deeper into the logistics of what 10-speed does, what you've done in other companies. So wanted to go back to the signs or the flags or however you want to kind of look at that. One, like kind of like going through in a checklist fashion, and I can just like chime in if I have questions or have other things that feel like they should be added. But essentially, like those early signs, right, of like it's not moldy yet, like it's not decaying yet, but like there's some signs like we need to look for it. Maybe it's still in that kind of yellow zone. So there's that, and then we can kind of go to the like this is definitely like stale, and here's kind of how you know. So yeah, going through kind of like those early indicators and that kind of a checklist that you might go through with clients.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think there's a couple factors here. There's sort of like qualitative and quantitative aspects to it. So there's certainly, and I think we'll get to it soon about like talking about like pruning content as well, but like you should just read the content. Like it's not just about the data and like whether or not you're losing impressions or clicks or anything like that. Like read the content and just understand, does this still fit what we're doing? Does this still speak to our ICP? And you can also then kind of check for some of the other stuff I talked about earlier about product screenshots and stuff like that. But it's definitely not just the numbers in a spreadsheet or in an interface that you're looking at. You need to actually read the content and kind of look at that objectively. So there's that, even if the data looks okay, you could say, hey, this is starting to feel a little bit outdated and might need to be updating, or we may need to get rid of it. So that's one. And then I would say the other is, checking across a couple factors. So where you feel the pain more is when you start to lose traffic, and that leads to not having, signups or demo requests, not having revenue. So that's where you feel the pain. But I would say that again, the early indicators that we want to check for are, is this starting to lose impressions? And typically what that means is that you have queries that were matching to this post that are no longer matching, which is a sign that says, hey, the search engine thought this fit what you were doing, but it doesn't, or you were kind of one of the best answers, and like information on this, but now there's someone else covering this better for these particular queries matching to it. So, impressions is not just impressions that like, oh, who cares, just impressions. It's a symptom of what's really going on that you kind of then dig in and really look at the query level for that specific piece to understand what are we missing. Kind of, okay, well, now we can see like 10 of the 50 that we lost are kind of all around this particular topic. We can start to make some assumptions there. So I would say those are kind of the big ones really is on the quantitative side. You're kind of just wanting to see where are we losing some of the early signals of maybe click-through rate that's less relevant or impressions, and then dig in deeper and try to diagnose why, where exactly is that loss coming from and why is that?
Nice. Yeah. And then when you look into the why, it could be that you're cannibalizing your own content, or it could be that it's like a competitor that's now better than you in terms of that specific topic or that content. Nice. Okay. And then so moving on to the more, this is definitely stale, or this is like well past, like when we should have updated it. That seems like it would be like a helpful learning lesson for clients or for anyone that's like, how could we have prevented this type of a thing? So what are kind of some scenarios you've seen where it's like, wow, like this is actively hurting us and this is definitely decay? Like what are some signs and even some examples you can think of?
Yeah, so I would say it's still very much from a data perspective, it's still very much those same signals. It's just that it becomes more definitive, I would say, that you're experiencing the loss. And then when you sort of analyze some of the SERPs around where you're losing, you could see, okay, yeah, like what we have versus what appears to be the intent behind this doesn't match up. And so we can understand why, or, a competitor put out, even more robust and applicable and relevant piece than us, or whatever it might be. So I'd say you really feel the pain. And the challenge with decay overall is like, there's not necessarily a great way, like there's like a very finite point in which it shifts from like, this is performing well to like, there may be an issue here. And so you don't typically want to try to address it so proactively when it's performing well, because some pieces could perform well as is for another 3 to 6 months. So why waste your bandwidth assuming it's going to be a problem and doing that. So it is kind of, that's what I think requires some of the systems, is that there's like, it's fine until it isn't. And then you have to start like understanding why. And then, the other piece to remember is like the internal competition, and just to better define that for people, like for us at Sprout, it's an easy example because we had tons of content. Twitter analytics, was a big general like query. And so we had like a Twitter analytics feature page. We talked about Twitter analytics in some of the solution stuff. And then we had easily dozens of posts on Twitter analytics. And so over time, as you just keep adding more on certain topics, certain queries can kind of overlap, and then it just becomes conflicting internally. And that can kind of ultimately confuse the search engine and make it difficult. So you just generally have the internal competition, the external competition, and then on top of that, every search engine, on every time someone searches a query, they are analyzing to try to make sure, like what you do to make sure they're giving the best result. So that's how they're trying to understand and interpret intent, changing their rankings. And so that is also a factor that, you can sometimes run into a SERP where Google or any other search engines clearly testing what is right there. You kind of have like some mixed intent. You maybe have like shopping stuff and some other results, or homepages and blog posts. And then either there can be points in which that tips and they decide like, we're doing this, one way or the other. And if that doesn't go in favor of what your content currently is, then you ultimately are on the losing end of that. So there are just kind of like these constant multiple variables running at any point that really run into that. So that's where I think, like I said, it's all working fine until it isn't. And there isn't like always a clear indication of when that's going to happen. So I would say, so the data is kind of the same, impressions, clicks, looking at all of that, you can have the similar alerts. It's just a matter of like when it happens for real and when it doesn't. And that's why you have to have the systems in place to be able to easily slot in, okay, we got to jump on this without it derailing all of your other content efforts. You have to have a place to easily just slot it in and deal with it in a timely fashion.
Yeah. So it sounds like you have to give Google a little bit of a grace period, right? Like they're going to take a little bit of time to just kind of like test whether or not you continue to deserve the top slot if something else comes in. So there's that. And then there's also a bit of a quantitative and qualitative audit. Like you mentioned, you actually do have to like read through the content and have like a human on it to catch things like that Google wouldn't catch, of like, this product screenshot is outdated. We know that because we work at the company. We know what the new product looks like, but Google doesn't necessarily know that. It doesn't know that it's like old and maybe less helpful to the end goal of getting them to convert. They just know if it's good content. So there's the qualitative side, and then there's more of the quantitative side that, flagging when the impressions are dropping, when the clicks are dropping, when your rankings are dropping, all of that. And so factoring those things in. So once you do go through, those two versions kind of like of that audit, you can flag things as different app statuses, right? And we talked about this before of like, does it belong in the backlog? Does it belong on this month's calendar, right? Like, how should we think about prioritizing this thing? So when should you think about refreshing or updating old content versus like scrapping it and starting fresh? What does that sort of like decision tree look like?
Yeah, I would say when you get into that, you really kind of need to think outside of what is currently there. What does this piece of content need to be? Like, not into the nitty gritty of, changing the copy, but like, just if I were starting from scratch, what would it need to be? And I think it's just sort of like, I think there's a bit of like your own tolerance for, like, some people like to just heavily edit something that's already there. And some people are like, I can't deal with that. I just need to start from scratch. So I think maybe an easy rule of thumb would be like, if you have to redo over 50% of it, it's either way, you're starting with what do I need this to be going forward? And then applying that to say, like, do I feel like I can easily, update what's there to get it there? Or do I just need to start over from scratch and just do it the way I know it needs to be done? And I think that's kind of, like I said, a bit of personal preference. And then outside of that, the only important thing really is like the best way to handle that case where like it's still the same post, still the same topic, you're just doing a bigger refresh, is just to make sure that you ultimately, like in the CMS, delete what's there and put in what you want it to be and keep it, and then like, publish it, the changes, and keep it on the same URL versus, changing to a new URL and setting up redirects in that case, because it's still the same topic. Ideally, your slug on the URL is pretty well optimized and everything there. So that's typically what you want to do if it all aligns. Otherwise, if it is a bit of a shift as well and like the URL doesn't fit anymore and you want like a bigger change, then yes, you want a new URL and then 301 redirect the other one to it.
Yeah, that makes sense. There's a lot of good callouts there. I think one thing is just deciding whether it's going to be two pieces total. Like essentially, will we have two different URLs for this, right? Are we still going to have this other piece, but maybe we need to add to it, and then we have this other kind of like supporting piece, or like are we consolidating and we either need to start from scratch again, still using maybe that same URL, but starting from scratch in terms of like the content, or like can we leverage what we have and add to it? And I think that 50% rule is a good one. The other one for me is just like structurally, like, is it going to take me more time to just like write a new outline and fill it in? Or is this like an add-on situation where like structurally this still makes sense, but maybe we just need more FAQs or, better intro. We need like just more examples, whatever it is. So it's more just like, does the structure still make sense, or do we need to rethink it? And in that case, it's probably easier to start from scratch.
Yeah, absolutely. My personal tolerance for updating existing is very low. It's probably like 10%. I just do not like, I'm not like an editor by trade. So like the idea of making big changes structurally, like rearranging existing, I'd rather just sort of take the good parts from what's there and like start fresh and put it in there. But to clarify, I would, in most cases, I would still stay on the same URL. It's just a sort of a personal process of how you get to the end result content. So
Yeah, they're like completely different skills. And so knowing like which one that you lean toward will probably like tell you like which thing's going to be faster, because they're for one person it may be easier to just update, and for another person's like, I need to just clean slate this or not try and like force this thing to work. And so sometimes you realize that as you're going along, like it just feels hard, and sometimes it's just like you can just see it. And so knowing kind of your personal preference is part of this. All right, so piggybacking kind of off of that, you mentioned pruning. I wanted to like make sure that we address anything we want to talk about there. So pruning meaning kind of when do we want to cut, essentially, right? So it's a little bit of the consolidation, but how do you think about pruning? What are kind of like some of the signs that needs to happen? Or do you have, a regular cadence that you use for clients on the pruning process?
Yeah. So I'd say there's two really big factors for pruning. So one is every search engine over time essentially is assigning a crawl budget to each website, which is essentially saying, based on what you have here and how frequently you update and how good the content is, how much people like it, like we're assigning the amount of bandwidth we're going to spend looking at your content. So I think a lot of people just assume that every search engine crawls every single page on their site every day, or, multiple times a day, all the time, even if it's crap, and like that's just not the case. And so you do want to maintain your overall footprint and not have crawlers kind of going off in the wrong direction, getting into all this old irrelevant content, and then finding a way out and leaving and missing good content or misinterpreting kind of like your overall expertise. So there is an importance there that if you like, even if you're like, it doesn't matter, like it doesn't rank, it doesn't get traffic, it doesn't matter that we have this old content on our site. It does if it's indexed or and crawlable, because you're kind of wasting bandwidth and potentially sending conflicting signals by having it there. So that's one aspect of it, is the crawl budget. And then the other is just sort of that like topic authority. So you want to have like present like, our company knows these topics well, we're experts. Anytime people are thinking about these topics, like you should understand that we are go-to. And so again, when you have kind of like all these offshoots into random topics, that sort of complicates it. So, it's pretty easy, again, read the post and be like, oh, this is about like these features we used to have in our product. We actually sunsetted them. Like, doesn't make sense. Like, great, prune it. At Sprout, like we used to have content about Foursquare and Koala from the early days. Like those apps stopped being, relevant and used. And so we don't need this content anymore and we can prune that content. So, early on, I think it's pretty like one-off and you'll kind of deal with it here and there. But when you get to scale, or if you're like a content marketer or an SEO person joining a company and kind of looking back through everything, you could probably be pretty ruthless because you're coming in sort of objectively. And so, towards the end of my time at Sprout, we had over 3,000 blog posts, and we were basically creating about, it varied depending on what we needed, about 16 new pieces a month, updating about 4 per month. So about a total of 20. And then we were typically aiming to prune 20 posts a month. So basically like overall keeping the total footprint pretty consistent, but making it just more and more densely packed with the most relevant stuff. So I would say that's kind of the biggest factors in terms of thinking about pruning.
Yeah. And whenever it comes to this point of like the signals to Google, essentially, right, of like by pruning and by adding and doing this process, you're essentially telling like, this is what I want to be known for. This is what we're good at, right? Like getting just a more narrow and specific about that. Like that's the other, big benefit to pruning is like, you may have written kind of like a fluff piece like before you came on. So it's kind of like reevaluating, like, does this align with our company strategy? Like just going all the way back to that level. It's you may have been more of a, trying to think of a good example, but like an AI tool, then you like branched out and you're more of like this like platform, right? And so thinking through like what you want to be known for is like, it's very similar to like a brand, right? And thinking about like personal brand or brand, it's like, it applies to content. What do we want to be known for? Is that obvious to Google, like in our content backlog and catalog?
Yeah. The funny thing, because we obviously get the opportunity to look at a lot of companies, and even if we don't end up working with them, we typically look at their data, in the process of talking to them and stuff. And I feel like it is extremely common to come across companies who have a pretty good set of content, and then everyone seems to have this one like BuzzFeed-esque post that is like one of their top traffic. It'd be like a customer service tool, and they'll have this piece on like 8 things you didn't know about Mick Jagger or something, and you're like, why? And it gets like twice as much traffic as everything else, and they're always like, oh yeah, everyone hates that post at our company or whatever, but no one wants to delete it because it like would just make our traffic look bad and whatever. And so it's just funny that like there always tends to be this one that like is the bane of people's existence, but like it's traffic driving. So those are always a great example of like short-term pain, yes, like, but it's pretty easy to explain to the board or or whatever you would need to do. Like, hey, this is kind of a one-time reset on our baseline. This is why we're not losing anything meaningful, and overall it should net positive. But yeah, it's funny. And that in terms of consolidation, I think I did want to touch on that real quick. That's certainly I think kind of starting with that same process where you're like, what do I want this to be? Like, what do I think, for this topic, what it should be? And then ultimately looking and kind of seeing, you may have multiple posts that kind of have parts of that and they're all kind of spread out, and you could actually bring it all into one and actually set up multiple 301 redirects. And when done right, like that can actually be a very, very significant impact on performance. We had an early client with 10Speed, was pretty fascinating. They had a blog post that pretty well covered the topic, and then they had another blog post that covered kind of like what we felt was the rest of the topic, and then they had a blog post that was just basically like almost no text. It was just their way of publishing a YouTube video that they had on the topic, and then separately they had a podcast episode on the topic. And so like 4 pages that were all kind of like on the same stuff. And so redid the one, brought the rest of the content into that one, pulled the YouTube video, embedded it into that post, and then also embedded podcast player, brought it all into one, redirected the other 3 to that, and then it had like doubled in like overall traffic compared to what those 4 were doing added together. And so it was just like, let's bring this all together, put it all in one place. It's much better UX for whoever's coming to your site. They get a lot more value. It's much easier for the search engine, like all that. So, those are certainly like not as common. It's just updating or, refreshing content. But when you have kind of come into a place where there's a lot of disparate stuff, there can be some good opportunities for larger consolidation like that.
Yeah, that's a really good example. Yeah, like the quick thing on, I do think that most companies have some sort of like weird BuzzFeed blog, right? That doesn't have to do with anything. So I think it's like a fun thing to kind of end on, because I was specifically thinking about like one that wasn't necessarily like a super BuzzFeed blog. It was like around sales, but the thing that we were ranking for, like the term that we were ranking for, like didn't have anything to do with sales, right? And so we kind of just let that one fall off, or actively like kills it, because it wasn't driving business. Like it wasn't going to drive business. It was like clear that there was an intent like around the search. But then on the flip side, like we actually, and I've seen, a couple like companies do this where they have kind of like a very kind of fluffy, like top of funnel type thing. But as long as it like appeals to your audience and like, in our case, like had to do with sales, like sometimes those things can work too. So there was one that was around like sales manager memes or something like that. So it's not like that, the highest priority, piece that you want to publish. But then surprisingly, because it would drive more volume, just because it was like high search type like inquiry, plus like the buzz it would get from social, it actually like drive in the same or more like conversions. And so that's like another thing to audit too, of like, what's actually driving the conversions? What's actually driving the customers? And is it a fluke? Is it doing that on repeat, right? So there's a couple things that are just going to be very like business dependent. And sometimes I'm very like humbled by it, where it's like, I would not have guessed that this was going to be a driver of signups, and it is. And so, how can we make it better?
Yeah. It's the bane of every marketer's existence, is no matter how much research you do and journalistic integrity and quality content, like the memes do better.
That's a beautiful way to end this. I did have just like the one last thing is just any advice that you'd give to either content marketers or marketers that want to have content updating, content maintenance like engine, that like want to feel like they have a process for this.
Yeah, I would say, establish, at least quarterly a time that is whatever, so 1 hour on your calendar or whatever you need, just a time at least every quarter to look at things purely from that lens of what needs to be updated or pruned, like what from a qualitative and quantitative standpoint. And then, in your planning process, have a lane for that. So if you're just jamming your content calendar so full of new stuff that you don't have room, then you suffer one way or the other. Like you either get thrown off your plan or you don't update the content. And then, outside of that, I would say, just be like making the updates and kind of getting into that process from there. I think those are probably the three biggest things really are, looking at it monthly or quarterly, having those slots in place to be able to deal with it in your content planning, and then making those updates on a regular basis. So yeah, so that would be the biggest thing, I think. And then outside of that, there are opportunities to do it kind of in a project basis, over a couple months, like update a lot. If you have a lot, you could jumpstart it, but you don't want to be something that you just do once a year, every year, and kind of do a big refresh and then let it decay. Because just over those other 9 months or 12 months, you're just losing in some of those cases. So yeah, I think you want to really maybe do it as a project to jumpstart, but then make sure it's an ongoing piece.
Nice. That was a great summary. I don't have anything to add. So
Awesome.
Where can people find you?
Yeah. So for 10Speed, if you're interested in checking it out, it's 10speed.io. And you can find me, I'm on Twitter at NPTurner and LinkedIn as Nate Turner and then the number 1 at the end.
Perfect. Well, Nate, thanks for going long here. I know I pushed it right up against the window. So thanks for talking through this, and we'll talk soon.
Yeah. Thanks, Camille.
Thanks for listening to Content Logistics. This episode was produced by Motion, a done-for-you B2B podcasting agency for busy marketers. If you liked what you heard, please follow the show on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts.